All right, well, we'll get started. I think there's still a few filtering in. So hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today for the third edition of Ask an Expert webinar series hosted by Marine Renewables Canada, or MRC as some of you call us. My name is Elisa Oberman. I'm the Executive Director at MRC, and I'm going to be your host for today. I think a lot of you that are joining us today are members of ours, but we also have some new faces. And so just a little bit about Marine Renewables Canada. We're the national association covering, obviously, offshore wind, tidal, wave, and river current energy. And over the course of the next year or so, we're going to be hosting a series of these webinars with experts to tackle Canadians' biggest questions about offshore wind. So before we get started, I would like to take a moment with all of you today to recognize and acknowledge the traditional territories and Indigenous peoples of the different lands that we are all on today. In particular, given we're coming together today to discuss offshore wind, I would invite all of us to think about the impacts that renewable energy projects can have on Indigenous communities and to reaffirm our commitment to improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures to ensure that marine renewable energy projects move forward inclusively and respectfully. So before turning this over to our expert guest today, we have a few housekeeping notes. One, you will notice that we are recording this webinar and it will be posted on MRC's website and YouTube page. We will be sending out a link to it after this, so if you miss anything, you're welcome to rewatch. The bulk of today's webinar will be focused on presentations, which will then be followed by a question period. So really the intention of today is to ensure that all of you that are joining us have an opportunity to get some very good information from our speakers, but also to ask some of the burning questions that you might have about offshore wind and in particular, the regulatory aspects that we're going to be discussing today. You are welcome to use the chat function or the Q&A function for questions. So we'll do our best to get to all of them today. But as you know, time will probably run out. And so what we'll try to do is also get back to you on some of the questions that we're not able to answer today. So today's topic is focused on the future of offshore wind regulation in Canada, but also insights from global best practices. So I'm very pleased to have two excellent speakers here with us today. We have Jon Brady, who is Deputy Director of the Renewable and Electrical Energy Division at Natural Resources Canada, and he leads the offshore renewables team, driving legislative, regulatory, and policy development for offshore renewable energy projects. Jon has been spearheading initiatives such as Bill C-49, which expands the mandate of the offshore petroleum boards to regulate these projects in Canada's offshore areas. His team has also been developing regulations under the Canadian Energy Regulator Act for federal offshore areas. We also have Gordon McIntosh, who has over 40 years of experience in the energy sector and has been involved with offshore wind since 2001. He co-founded Aberdeen Renewable Energy Group, or AREG, to bolster the region's economy by integrating renewables alongside North Sea oil and gas. In his role at Aberdeen International Associates, Gordon consults for offshore wind developers and provides advice to governments on offshore wind licensing and power-to-X. Gordon's extensive career includes roles as Deputy Minister of Natural Resources for Newfoundland and Labrador, and Director of Economic Development for Aberdeen City. So thank you both very much for being here today and being generous with your time in talking about a topic that I think is going to be of a lot of interest to many of those that are joining us today. So we're going to get started and I will turn it over to you, Jon, and I'm just going to get your presentation up here. Make sure I have the right one. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. While you're doing that, I'll just begin.
Okay.
So, perfect. Lovely. Thank you very much. And thanks for hosting us here today. I'm coming from Ottawa and also the unceded traditional lands of the Anishinaabe people. And I'm happy to take this time today to walk through some of the context, history, background of legislative and regulatory developments for offshore wind here in Canada, and then look forward to what is to come in the time ahead. So with that, next slide, please. So I think that most of you here know that Canada has incredible potential for offshore wind. Anybody living in Atlantic Canada does not need to be told the potential for offshore wind, and whether that is the world-class offshore wind resources, or more broadly speaking, the positive investment climate, decades worth of regulatory regime when it comes to offshore petroleum, and of course, ambitious targets with regards to net zero electricity emissions by 2035 and net zero economy by 2050. But in order to unlock this potential, there are, of course, some necessary enabling conditions, be they legislative, regulatory, or beyond. And so we're going to speak about that here today. Next slide, please. Bit of history on how we got to where we are. For those of you who are unaware, back in 2019, the Canadian Energy Regulator Act was stood up, and this was a transition from the National Energy Board Act. And with that notably came Part 5 of that act, which enabled the Canada Energy Regulator to be the life cycle regulator for offshore renewable energy projects and their associated power lines in the federal offshore. And so that created the legislative canopy that was necessary, the enabling authorities, and the ability to create regulations underneath that act, which is what we've been up to since then. And so Part 5 of that act enabled regulations respecting essentially how a project could be reviewed. And so that included looking at the specific remit underneath the act of safety, security, and environmental protection with that lens, looking at these projects. But also, of course, the contents of future applications for any authorizations to carry out any work or activities related to an offshore wind project, and more broadly, offshore renewable energy projects. And so it also spoke to, of course, the conditions that those authorizations would be subject to. Next slide, please. And so we've been working from 2020 on till now in that process towards developing these regulations, recognizing at first that this is not something that Canada had done before. While we had decades worth of experience and regulators and regulatory regime when it came to offshore energy, that was in the context of petroleum. And of course, this is very different with offshore wind. And so after doing an international scan of how other countries and jurisdictions were running their regulatory regime and their regulations for these projects, we then brought forward a discussion paper in 2020 outlining the general approach and the principles, followed by a technical requirements paper in 2021, which laid out a draft of what the regulations could look like. We had follow-up workshops in 2022 with regards to certificate of fitness and certifying authorities and the role that they would play. And then in 2023, we released a draft of the regulations with the stakeholders who had been actively participating along the way. And then just a couple of weeks ago, not even actually, in late February, we released the proposed regulations themselves and pre-published them in the Canada Gazette 1 for public comment. Next slide, please. Wonderful. So about the regulations themselves, you'll be able to see, if you haven't already, the regulations and the background information with regards to the intent and the approach for the regulations online. And the link will be shared here in the presentation. But just to provide an overview of what these regulations are really looking to do is really provide a comprehensive requirements for how these applications and the execution of the work underneath the regulatory regime could function. Is intended to provide clarity to stakeholders on what is expected for these projects, and also to identify what the application requirements would be, such as safety plans, environmental protection plans, emergency response plans, and others. And is also meant to build on, of course, best practices in other offshore wind and offshore renewables regimes around the world, as well as leverage our experience and our understanding through the existing regimes and regulations for offshore petroleum. The regulations themselves are meant to be flexible and allow for innovation and for the industry to evolve, as we all recognize that particularly the offshore wind industry, is constantly evolving and in magnitudes of evolution, really. And so we want to ensure that the regulations we bring forward here today in 2024 are fit and flexible for the decade plus to come. And of course, as we learn, we will all adjust accordingly, but we want to make sure that these regulations are not prescriptive based and rigid in their function and application. And then with regards to how these regulations are actually organized, you'll see in the regulations that essentially they are scoping out the three major phases of a project: the site assessment phase, or some might view it as the exploratory phase, the construction and operations phase, and the decommissioning and abandonment phase. Next slide, please. So here's the information that will be made available with this presentation as it's shared for where to go to view the regulations and to provide any comments. We will then take your comments and review the regulations accordingly and adjust as necessary and as deemed to be so. And then we will move forward with targeting final publication when these regulations will come into force and in effect in the fall of 2024. The deadline, as you can see here, is March 25, and we look forward to your comments. Many of you come to offshore wind with the Accord Acts in mind, and Bill C-49 in particular, which of course has got a lot of attention since it's been introduced, and rightfully so. And so there might be some of you wondering how the federal legislation, CER Act, and the regulations I was just speaking to, how it fits with the Accord Acts and the amending of these Accord Acts. And so I want to just take a moment here to provide that nexus between these two pieces of legislation and the regulations underneath them. So as many of you know, Bill C-49 proposes to amend the Canada-Nova Scotia and respectively the Canada-Newfoundland-Labrador Accord Acts and the mandates of the respective offshore boards, and to expand that mandate to include offshore renewables. Once the Accord Acts are in force, they will stand down the CER Act off the coast of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland Labrador. And so the CER Act will no longer apply for offshore renewable energy projects off the coast of those two respective provinces. And instead, the Accord Acts, as they're stood up and come into force and become law, will take their place and replicate what has been the situation for over 34 years now with regards to offshore petroleum. And so similarly, the regulations that are developed under the CER Act would not be implemented in the Accord areas. Instead, we are developing the CER regulations to provide a basis and a baseline so that we have consistency and coherency of regulations on all three coasts. And we will then be replicating these regulations with our provincial partners in a fashion that is in tune to the Accord Acts in the future. And so these federal regulations provide a keyhole, a sight line as to how the regulations off the coast of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland Labrador under the Accord Acts could look, but certainly they won't be exactly the same as under the amended Accord Acts. And so that process for the future regulations under the Accord Acts will come along as the amended Accord Acts themselves become law and receive royal assent. And I'll get into timelines here shortly. Next slide, please. All right, a little bit of a history here on the accords themselves, the Accord Acts and the accord regimes. Many of you will be very familiar with them, and some, particularly from overseas, might not be. But essentially, since the 1980s, Canada and Nova Scotia and Canada and Newfoundland Labrador have jointly managed the development of petroleum resources under mere legislation known as the Accord Acts. And so both at the federal and provincial level, we have the same legislation that is passed through our respective parliaments or legislatures. And that legislation essentially appoints and enables the offshore petroleum boards, which are independent regulators, to be the life cycle regulator for offshore petroleum development off the coast of these two provinces. Now, in April of 2022, our respective governments announced that the intention was to expand the mandate of the joint Accord Acts and offshore petroleum boards to include offshore renewables, with a focus in particular on offshore wind. And in May of last year, the federal government, after intensive collaboration with our provincial partners, brought forward the federal version of the bill, which is Bill C-49. And that bill is currently going through the federal parliamentary process as we speak. Next slide, please. A little bit about what is in the amended Accord Acts with regards to offshore renewable energy and offshore wind. I will speak to offshore renewable energy broadly because these amendments, whether it's for the Canada Energy Regulator Act or the Accord Acts, covers beyond offshore wind. It covers wave, tidal, and really any renewable energy in the offshore. It is not a restricted list. And so if there are new offshore renewable energy technologies that emerge over the coming decades, these acts will already be able to address them. Specifically with regards to the amended Accord Acts, some of the notables here is with regards to the land tenure process. For those of you familiar with the offshore petroleum regime in Atlantic Canada, you'll know that there are numerous licenses that are issued, be they exploratory license, significant discovery license, or production licenses. Given that for offshore wind, we are talking about the seabed and the licensing of the use of the seabed, there will be a single submerged land license for the seabed. Also, recognizing that offshore wind projects are notably different than offshore petroleum, and that there is an important need to understand where it is suitable for offshore wind projects to be located in the context of other users of the ocean and the environment and living beings in the ocean. We recognize that offshore wind is powerful and strong throughout most of the region, and often it's not the wind itself that is the determinant of where the suitable locations are for offshore wind. So given all that, there is built in to how we are proceeding with offshore wind, spatial area planning exercises and activities, the regional assessments of offshore wind development off the coast of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland Labrador, which are already underway, and I'll come to shortly, are one of the main pieces that we are, as governments, using to identify suitable areas for offshore wind. And these regional assessments will help inform where the regulators recommend and respective ministers decide on where future call for bids could be for the seabed parcels related to the submerged land license process. Another element that is notable is a streamlined decision-making process for these call for bids, which is to say that for the federal and provincial ministers, they will be deciding when to initiate a call for bids and the issuance of seabed licenses upon the recommendation of regulators. And a big part of the driver for that is, again, recognizing the context of offshore wind and how it's different than offshore petroleum. So we know that for offshore wind, you need an offtake market. You're not going to be developing large offshore wind projects, many megawatts or possibly gigawatts worth of production and capacity without a market for that, whether it be the grid or for hydrogen or for exports. And so there needs to be coordination by governments and ministers representing governments as to when it makes sense to proceed with a call for bid and what that could look like in terms of its potential markets and timing. And so we want to make sure that these are ministerial decisions upon the recommendations of regulators, following the regulators' process for identifying where these potential call for bid parcels could be. And again, on the heels of these regional assessments, which are already beginning to do that spatial area planning work. Also included are principles for full and fair opportunity and inclusion of underrepresented groups that is enshrined in the legislation, and to make sure that we maximize economic opportunities for local businesses and underrepresented groups and peoples underneath these regimes, while at the same time respecting the constraints of international trade law. And not surprisingly, the name of the offshore boards will be changing once the legislation is passed to the Offshore Energy Regulators, and they will be the life cycle regulator for offshore wind in these accord areas. Next slide, please. Now, Canada's new to offshore wind, and we are not going to pretend that we're not. So we are proceeding with making sure that we have cohesion, coordination, and cooperation by all of our federal authorities, provincial authorities, and life cycle regulators. And to that end, we launched in January of last year the Federal Offshore Wind Regulatory Working Group, which is meant to bring everybody together under the federal and provincial roof to make sure that we all understand the process that is being put forward by the amended Accord Acts, the CER Act, and how that interweaves with existing authorities from other federal departments such as Environment Canada, Transport Canada, Fisheries and Oceans, with regards to their authorizations. And so we convene on a fairly frequent basis to go through different scenarios and understandings and make sure that there's strong coordination and that there's a frame there in place for that when we do get to call for bids and beyond, that everybody knows kind of how to proceed and what the intention is going forward. Next slide, please. The regional assessments that I spoke to, they were launched in March of 2023. And these were established as independent committees that were appointed by the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and will report back to both him and our Minister of Natural Resources Canada, and then respective ministers, both in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador. There are 2 separate regional assessments occurring, one off each coast. And while they are endeavoring to accomplish many things, at the root of it, the focus will be to identify and help identify suitable areas and constraints and inform government's decisions with regards to future call for bids. And we have an interim report that is expected later on this month from the respective RA committees. And then another major piece that they are working towards is understanding and informing future regulatory reviews, including impact assessments, and the reviews by the life cycle regulators and other authorities with regards to drawing from experiences in other countries. What have we seen in terms of effects from offshore wind projects in other countries around the world, identifying what the mitigation measures and the follow-up programs for those have been in other countries, and bringing them back to governments and regulators so that we have a very eyes wide open understanding of what those could be. And so that we're better prepared for when we get to actual projects. Next slide, please. And so here is a bit of a timeline in terms of where we have been and where we're going. You'll see that on the left-hand side, many of these things I've already spoken to and have been accomplished with regards to the launching of the regional assessments, the engagement on the draft regulations from the federal side, the introduction of Bill C-49 in May of last year, our recent publishing in the Canada Gazette 1 of the federal regulations. And then we are anticipating the first interim report delivered by the RA committee later on this month. Looking forward, we are looking towards the potential royal assent, which is the federal approval at the parliamentary level of Bill C-49 before the summer recess this year. Of course, that's contingent on how MPs and senators proceed through that process and is really in their control in their hands. So we are, of course, beholden to that democratic process. And then looking into the fall of this upcoming year, we have the expectation, as I said, of the coming into force of the federal regulations under the Canada Gazette 2. And then, as I mentioned before, we will be replicating those regulations under the Accord Acts as appropriate with our provincial partners and making the first public publishing of those regulations in fall of 2024. And then we also are looking towards completing those regulations towards the end of 2024 That'll be dependent again on some of the trickle-down effect of Bill C-49 and how that proceeds. But beyond the regulations underneath the Accord Acts, there will also be the actioning of the new amended Accord regime, which would include ministers providing strategic priorities, which would be directions to the offshore regulators on how to proceed and considerations towards a future call for bid. And then in 2025, we will have the second report by the regional assessments delivered in early 2025, and positioning everybody, all Canadians and everybody else, to have a good understanding of where suitable areas could be, recommendations to government to make decisions on where these areas could be, and call for bids could be launched in 2025. The 2025 call for bids is a recognition of the Nova Scotia government's announcement a couple of years ago, in fall of 2022, I believe, to seek up to 5 gigawatts worth of seabed licenses through 2025 to 2030. And this would be done in the offshore Accord areas under the amended Accord regime. And last slide, please. Finally, just a look ahead here, building on the timelines. What does this all mean? How do we envision this looking by this time next year? Well, we anticipate, as I said, that pending the parliamentary and subsequent provincial legislative process, that the Accord Acts, both federally and provincially, would be finalized and passed and come into force, and that the offshore energy regulations, be they the federal ones or the subsequent ones that will be replicated under the Accord Act regimes, would also be in force in 2024 and in 2025. The understanding of suitable areas is a recognition, of course, of the regional assessments that will provide governments with recommendations upon which governments will make decisions as to how to proceed, and the regulators will begin the call for bid process that would ultimately lead towards where seabed parcels would be provided in an auction format for these future projects. And then we would have, in particular off the coast of Nova Scotia, the first call for bids intended in 2025 based on provincial announcements. Through all of this time and, going backwards and forwards, engagement with, of course, our provincial partners from the federal level, Indigenous partners, fisheries, stakeholders, and others on these and the other enabling conditions that go beyond the scope of legislation and regulation, which I'm speaking about today, but are also enabling conditions that are necessary for offshore wind to be realized and for the opportunity to be unlocked here in Canada. And with that, I will turn it over to Lisa or Gordon. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Jon. And obviously, a lot of work has been done by you and your team since those commitments that were made in April 2022, and a lot of work ahead. So I would encourage everyone that's joining today, also please feel free to type in your questions as we go along, and I will get to them when we get to the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to load up Gordon's presentation here. Just one second. Okay. There we go. Gordon, you can see that okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Alyssa.
All right, perfect. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back in Canada virtually once again. And I'm looking forward to the question and answer session beyond this. Firstly, thank you for your presentation, Jon, and congratulations on getting the regulations published. I can remember back to 2018 and speaking to Christine Trombley about what might be needed in terms of regulation, and you really have come from a standing start to really producing a really strong set of regulations in such a short time. That is, and I do mean that is quick in relation to global terms. So if we move to the first slide, A couple of years ago, I was asked to do a piece of work for a government body in relation to what are the best practices and what are some of the challenges in relation to licensing and regulation for offshore wind. I spoke to some developers and researched some learned papers, and I came up with these headlines here. So some of the recommendations, the first one was any government looking at this should look at mapping the offshore wind areas, the areas that they are planning to have offshore wind. To set an offshore wind target, that clearly sets out to those interested parties, developers, etc., just what it is in terms of quantification that you're aiming to get to within a set period of time. One of the big things that came through, and I'll go back to this as I move through the slides, is a one-stop shop. Clear indications globally, especially around Europe, that in many cases it's a parallel process and not a one-stop shop. But there's been movement since then, and I'll mention that as we go forward as well. There's a clear indication that there was a sense that any government looking to move forward should develop a guidance document for environmental licensing. And probably one of the most important things, and something that came through loud and clear and does all the time to me, is that there needs to be clear guidance and expectation and consultation. Consultation is one of the biggest elements here, especially when an industry is new and moving quickly, and there are other people in the same area working and making their living in the same area, and obviously there are environmental connections there as well. I noted in Jon's statement about full and fair opportunity. It was good to see that. One of the recommendations that comes through is that there are supply chain development statements about how you can engage with and help local industry develop in the various countries that have adopted offshore wind so far. The development of environmental studies, a range of environmental studies in advance, and the sharing of data rooms, for example, is another clear flag. And then finally, that governments should, especially in their early days, consider open door options. Denmark, for example, has very much an open door where you can rock up and look at an area offshore and have a discussion with them and putting your project there. So having an open door option as well as individual licensing rounds. I'll say a little bit about the UK later, but clearly my understanding is best and focused in the UK. So those best practice pointers are there just as a starter. So we move on to the next slide. So in Scotland, clearly that's where I am based and where I am focused. My experience there goes back to the early 2000s in AREG, and I was a director of one of the projects there called Aberdeen Bay, or European Offshore Wind Deployment Centres, interchangeable. But really in Scotland, it was round about the millennium that we started looking at offshore wind, and the UK government looked to develop its first round. And its first round was an open round. You could have a discussion with the Crown Estate and then take that forward in relation to where you wanted to develop your project. And that was very much the case with us in the European Offshore Wind Deployment Centre when it came round to 2004 and we were looking at it. I've slipped in there that piece about organic growth because we've been very fortunate in that we have grown and learned over a period of now nearly 23 years, which has allowed us to learn quite a bit. But in many ways, Scotland and the UK were at the forefront as well, so we had to learn by our mistakes. One of the first projects that we had was very close to the oil and gas industry. It was what I call the old Beatrice. So Beatrice was an oil and gas platform. There were 3 turbines put into that, tied back to the platform in 2007. And some of the characters in the offshore wind industry today were involved in the development of that field. Then there wasn't an awful lot happened on the ground or under the water, if you like. We, in the Aberdeen Bay project, had put forward a proposal for this European Offshore Wind Deployment Centre to really look at at how we could provide a focus for the city of Aberdeen and look at how technology could be developed, especially going into deeper water. But round about 2016, we got approval, and then there was the High Wind project off Peterhead, that was the first floating wind project from Equinor, as they are now, and also the Kincardine floating project off Aberdeen, all being focused around in that area in 2016. And since then, we've seen Beatrice, the new Beatrice, as opposed to the old Beatrice, Murray East, Murray West, developing at the moment, and Seagreen to the south of Aberdeen and off Montrose. So quite a bit of growth in the last period. So if we move forward to the next slide. So just to give you as a bit of a case, an example of the European Offshore Wind Deployment Centre. We started that, as I said, back in 2004, Aberdeen Renewable Energy Group, initially with partners AMEC, that I know had a presence in Atlantic Canada and were taken over by Wood about 7-8 years ago. AMEC's wind division decided in 2009 they wanted to divest themselves of the project, and Vattenfall, the Swedish utility, came on board. And really we were focused on taking wind from 10 to 30 meters. In those early days, we're at 10 meters, looking out to 30 meters, not the 60, 70 meters that Seagreen's in now. And as I said, we had an early discussion with the Crown Estates, and it was very organic in its development, we felt. I remember the 2 years of bird studies in particular. And we went through a process that wasn't very well organized, with 29 separate layouts under discussion with the various interested parties. And I don't think that we got our consultation didn't do a very good job in terms of consultation from the beginning. So, a lesson from us back then was the consultation piece, get involved, whether you're government or a developer, right from the beginning. We ended up with almost an emergency meeting with 64 people around the table, with all the representative parties, including the Harbour Board, whose land we were adjacent to their land that we were looking to put the Aberdeen Bay wind farm. But obviously, groups such as Fisheries, the Royal Society of Prevention of Birds, Air Traffic Control, Coast Guard, everyone was there and all had their concerns. But we managed to get to a solution with 11 turbines, just over 92 megawatt. And that sits there today as testament to an awful lot of hard work by the team who put that together, including several volunteers on the board of ARIG. Then, of course, we didn't manage to get through that without Donald Trump coming on the scene. We had previously managed to attract him to invest in golf off Aberdeen, but he didn't like the idea of a wind farm. So he took us right through to the Supreme Court and took the Scottish Government through to the Supreme Court. And there's a whole story in that by itself. But it certainly provided us with a promotional opportunity for offshore wind that we wouldn't have had otherwise. Moving forward to the next slide. So I'm now going to go to the Scottish system. We started as part of a UK-wide system of licensing, but in 2010 there were some changes, and Crown Estate Scotland took responsibility for the leasing of the seabed off Scotland. It was devolved to Scotland, and Marine Scotland was set up to look after the license. Well, they were set up before that to look at all aspects of marine and ocean life, including the fisheries and all the research issues, including the science related to that. But Marine Scotland established a licensing department, MS Lot, and one of the most successful things that they have done, I think, and it's recognised far and wide, is to establish a very effective one-stop shop for licensing and permits. It's been seen to work effectively, especially in the most recent period that I'll mention towards the end of the presentation in Scotland. They also introduced supply chain development statements, much criticism of the lack of local content, if you like, in Scotland. And given that wind in many ways had its early days in Scotland, onshore wind up in Orkney, and then the Danes overtook us and did fantastically well, but to such an extent that most of the supply chain work and the value wasn't coming to Scotland. So there's been a real move in relation to the oil and gas industry and looking at the subsea piece in particular to look at maximising supply chain from within Scotland in much the same way as Jon set out the full and fair opportunity piece. And to this date, I think AREG, I've chaired 6 different sessions with 6 different developers over those opportunities going forward in the new developments in Scotland. The consultation piece is very, very well set out in relation to what you have to do and the expectations in relation to consultation. And if we move on to the next slide, I can show you here now, and I would recommend, now I don't have time to go through this in detail today, but this is the document. It's a 64-page document from Marine Scotland, Consenting and Licensing Guidance. It's fantastic. Page 31 has got a really good diagram of the timings and of what's required at various stages. And the different sections are overview of consents and licenses, pre-application, determination, and post-determination. Very well worth a read. It's been well thought out after thinking and consulting over 5, 6, 7 years. So I would recommend that to anyone who is interested in the good quality licensing system from a different country. Moving on to the next slide. Now, I'm very aware that that piece about consultation is going to be important in Canada. Having worked in Newfoundland and Labrador and worked closely with Nova Scotia over the years, as well as other provinces, and worked globally in the oil and gas industry, the fisheries industries in particular will be, I'm quite sure, concerned, at least with regards to any new industry coming alongside them. So it's very important that there is good guidance in relation to the role of fisheries and how that relates to renewable energy. So I've put in front of you here a piece of guidance, best practice guidance for offshore fisheries that's basically chaired by the Crown Estate, but all these parties shown on the document are part of that, and more in fact. And the purpose of that is to foster good relations between the fishing and offshore renewable energy sectors and to encourage coexistence between the 2 industries. And basically all the fishing organisations in the UK are party to that guidance. The guidance has been reviewed at the moment, but it's stood in good stead so far. And I think it's worth saying at this point that the Scottish Fisheries Federation in particular have been very, very active in ensuring that their members are well represented. And in fact, they have launched their own environmental business. And I think over 500 boats now from the Scottish fisheries fleet have been involved in aspects of the renewable energy industry. The contents in there are very important topics. There's a good guide in there that's not as long as the 62 pages in the previous slide. The UK offshore renewables leasing process and in the UK consenting process. Then there's a piece about managing contact throughout the development phase. And there's liaison during the planning, construction and operational phases. A separate section on mitigation, coexistence planning, then safety zones during the important construction, operational and the decommissioning phases. The use of fishing vessels during survey, construction and operational activities. A whole section on fouling or loss of gear and equipment, and then a section on dealing with claims associated with fouling or loss. And I'm sure that these are all topics that the fishing industry will be interested to learn more about at the moment as Canada goes forward as a new industry going forward very, very quickly. And I think that's an important piece. I think the Scottish Fishermen's Federation put an offer to a group from Guysborough, which included 2 representatives of the fishing industry who visited Aberdeen 4 weeks ago. And I think there's an open door to Canada to come and speak to the Scottish Fisheries Federation, to fishers and to government and to developers as to how they have approached, on behalf of their members, the topics of interest in relation to the development of offshore wind in particular. So we move forward to, and I'm aware of the time in terms of questions. I briefly wanted to put in this slide here. This was the 2021-22 Scotland leasing round. 26 gigawatts of offshore wind. Round about half of that is floating, half of it's fixed. About 10 gigawatts of that is likely to be hydrogen production, with a pipeline or 2 pipelines going down into Europe directly. So very, very exciting times. And we haven't really moved round to the west of Scotland yet, where the wind is stronger, if you like. Most of it is in the North Sea, or to the north, to the west of Orkney, and to the north of the Isle of Lewis, as you can see. And the list there gives you an indication of companies who have also shown an interest in offshore Canada. You can see Canadian companies in there, such as Northland Power. So I'm aware of the time, Alyssa, so I think I should stop there and hand back to yourself. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Gordon. And I mean, some of the best practices, obviously, that you brought up are just extremely relevant to where we are in Canada. So I'm anticipating some good discussion here during the Q&A. I'm going to stop share here, and I will, just one second, I'm just going to exit out of this. Okay, so we have a few questions that have come in. I also have some questions, but I'm going to hang on to them, and I didn't share them with you ahead of time, so I'm just going to put you on the spot if we get to that point, but otherwise I'll follow up with you after. I'm just looking through the Q&A, and so first question, I think this is to Jon. What do you think the initial call for bids will look like? Will it be a subsidized call with a fixed consumer cost per kilowatt hour, a contract for difference, or something else?
Okay, thanks for the question. And it's an important question. Those decisions haven't been made yet. I recognize that the question was asking, what do I think? Ultimately, those will be decisions made by respective governments and ministers with regards to what the nature of the call for bids or the seabed license auction would look like. I would say that I think all countries and governments are very aware of the transition of how these seabed licenses have gone over the last 5 to 10 years. We've seen multiple criteria bids and auctions in European jurisdictions. We've seen only a cash bid in the US for quite some time. I think we are past the days of only a cash bid and a recognition that the prices can get so high that they can actually impact the cost of the project, which ultimately gets reflected in the impact to ratepayers, which nobody wants. And so those decisions will be taken by governments. And quite frankly, when it comes to these type of projects, because they're going to be offshore wind to grid or offshore wind to shore and hydrogen projects, the provinces will have a real essential role. I would say a lead role in terms of the timing, the sequencing of when these projects are needed. It will be provincial utilities and provincial governments that will be identifying how much, when, and where to a large degree. And so the nature of the dynamics of the call, whether it be subsidized or contract for differences or other measures, will be reflected as part of those decisions and at the time that it makes sense. Contract for differences is a fairly new thing here in this part of the Western world, less so in the UK and other jurisdictions. But even those mechanisms are shifting and changing, as we've seen in recent rounds in the UK and other jurisdictions. So I think there's kind of a lot of time and place nuance to what type of mechanisms are used. But ultimately, the intention is to ensure that the ratepayers are not on the hook for this. And so how that is done in a manner that is decided by governments is yet to be seen.
Okay, thank you. And related to that, Jon, just a kind of an add-on question. And I'm not sure if you'll be able to provide an example of this or not, but In the timeline that you provided, there was the call for strategic priorities that would go out around the bid strategic priorities. Just not that you know what those are going to look like, but do you have an example of what kind of criteria or what that might look like? Like what would be deemed a strategic priority?
Yeah, so those will reflect what government's priorities are of the day. So they're not hardwired into legislation because, of course, priorities of governments change over time. And we're building something for the years ahead, the decades ahead, frankly. And so I think we can see, whether it be provincial governments or federal governments, what some of the major priorities of these governments are in this time and place. And those would be reflected in these strategic directions, strategic priorities by ministers to the offshore energy regulators, and would help guide the regulators in how they approach, a call for bid process. And so, to give a hypothetical example, if there's been a lot of discussion about offshore wind for hydrogen, but I think also offshore wind to grid is, very much part of the discussion when we think about electrifying the economy and getting to net zero electricity and ultimately emissions by 2035 and 2050 respectively. And so ensuring that the ultimate target for this offshore wind is reflected in these strategic priorities I would imagine be very likely. And so it wouldn't be just broadly, we as governments are seeking offshore wind. It would be to meet a strategic priority and a specific purpose.
Okay.
That's what we anticipate, but ultimately up to ministers to make those decisions in governments.
Great. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. Question for both of you. So the basis of the question is that there are several initiatives elsewhere, so other jurisdictions, that seek to co-locate renewable energy and other activities. So for example, aquaculture, oil and gas. So part one of this question is to Jon. So do the Accord Acts address the responsibilities of the board in relation to co-location or allow for co-location? And then the second part of the question would be to Gordon, just some thoughts on how other jurisdictions have handled that kind of co-location mandate or question. So I'll turn it to Jon first.
Thanks. So what the regional assessments that are underway right now, part of what that is, and currently is looking at the various uses of the ocean. And so co-location and recognizing, first of all, where everybody is and where they're operating, and juxtaposing that with where offshore wind may make sense based on geographic and physical constraints, and then having that clear picture for all of us as to how these various use of the oceans and beings and existing activities, fishing being of course the principal one, how they are operating where and what that looks like with potential offshore wind areas. Based on that, as we move along here, and from the draft report to the final report in January of next year, we will all have a better understanding of what that dynamic could look like. To answer your specific question with regards to the Accord Acts and do they account for co-location, the Accord Acts, as they haven't for offshore petroleum, don't speak to kind of how co-location will work. But co-location, of course, is an essential part of any time you have, in this case, energy development occurring in the offshore. And so where that would be reflected is it could be reflected in things such as strategic priorities that we talked about already. It could be reflected in how the call for bid process is run and kind of on what criteria. It could be identified through the follow-up process of launching and running a call for bid process and understanding further where everybody is and kind of what potential impacts of a seabed parcel issuance under a call for bid could be to various users of the oceans or lack of impact. And it could also, of course, and where it will really be extremely relevant is beyond all those steps. Once, if a seabed license is issued, then the project would go into the full regulatory review process. And so that would include impact assessments, that would include the life cycle regulator, the offshore energy regulators running their review process. And so for an example, they have, of course, a mandate for environmental protection that would be very much front and center with regards to co-location and coexistence. And then through all the other federal authorities that would have their own remit for review of a project proposal from cradle to grave, be it from site assessment to the construction, operation, and decommission of a project. And of course, those other authorities include Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Environment and Climate Change, Transport Canada. There are a lot of different, it's a big ocean, but it gets pretty small when you consider how everybody's using it for a living or as a life. And so co-location or understanding of the potential dynamics of co-location have to play themselves throughout all of that process, and then on into the operation of the project and ensuring that that co-location or that project is done in a manner and is operating in a manner as the conditions apply to that authorization required it to. And with that, I'll turn it over to Gordon.
Thanks, Jon. Yes, Alyssa, I think, it's a big topic, co-location, but there are a number of examples in the UK sector. I mentioned ScotWind. It was followed up very quickly by another round called INTOC, which is really focused specifically on wind and electricity for offshore oil rigs. So that was another 4 or 5 gigawatt. And there's a tremendous amount of work going on just now with the oil companies. I had a meeting with Shell last week, really crying out for that developments to take place in relation to the ability of that offshore wind farms to supply green electricity to the oil rigs to decarbonize them. But if you come away from the wind piece, there's also an example. There's a company just now that we work with called Zoex, and it's a wave company, and it's working alongside the Scottish fish farming industry to provide electricity for fish farms in the west coast of Scotland on a pilot basis. There are other opportunities, obviously, for collaboration and sharing of infrastructure costs between the different companies. Another example that there is at the moment, and I know one of the companies is working and has been participating in Nova Scotia. It's a company called Motion Energy, which is a different wave company, different device, but they're looking at trials with Verloom on battery storage for, again, servicing offshore oil and gas. And we have a Swedish client as well called Noviocean, and they're a wave company, but they are advocating a proposal whereby their wave machines sit in between the wind turbines. Now that's got a long way to go environmentally, but you can see how they would complement each other in relation to security of supply, etc. So yeah, there's a lot happening. It's a big subject, and Jon has set out very clearly, some of the challenges and the consultation again that needs to go through in that front. But yeah, I would say it is happening in the Scottish sector.
Yeah, I think definitely an area to watch, because as we know, just innovation and technology, things continue to evolve. And there's probably going to be, greater opportunity too for co-location as technologies evolve as well. So thank you both, for your insight on that topic. I'm cognizant we are at time, but we do have quite a few questions left. So for those of you in the audience, we will do our best to get back a Q&A on some of the ones that we weren't able to get to today. But for now, I would like to thank both Jon and Gordon very much for your time and for joining us and providing some really informative information and just your thoughtful presentations. I think were just great to kind of kickstart this discussion around regulatory development. And for those, we had a few questions too about whether or not the slides will be provided to the audience. So we will have a recording of the webinar that will be publicly available, and we'll make sure everybody has a link for that. And so also thank you to all the attendees that joined us today. One thing I will note is if there are other topics that you have interest in, let us know. Just send us an email and we'll hope to address it. But our next webinar in the series is going to focus on lessons learned and best practices for coexistence with other ocean users. So fisheries, tourism, shipping. So stay tuned for more details on that, and we'll be sending out some information about that next webinar soon. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and have a good day.